Welcome to the Backstage Stories of Women on Stage, a podcast by Women on Stage recorded live. Let's go backstage and amplify the voices of leading women in tech from all across the globe. Get inspired and learn something new. Because if you can see it, you can be it. Join us. Visit womenonstage.net.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Backstage Stories of Women on Stage, the podcast where we amplify the voices of leading women in tech. I'm Moran, the CEO and founder of Women on Stage, and today we'll be hosting Sara Zare, an entrepreneur and an investor, and she has 3 engineering degrees from 3 different continents on 3 different languages. And we're here to discuss with Sara the philosophy of women in STEM, cultural differences, false beliefs, and stereotypes. And it's going to be a very, very, very interesting discussion. So, hi, Sara. It's so nice to have you here. Welcome.
Hi, Moran. Nice to see you again. Thank you for having me here.
I'm so glad to have you here. I just want to say, I want to tell everybody that I think this is the 4th time we've been speaking, and every time, like, our conversations are so interesting, and I'm sure this talk and this podcast, this episode is going to be really, really, really cool. So stay tuned, everybody. And I know that, Sara, you previously told me that people told you that you should have been a philosopher. So,
Well, the funny thing is, I was talking to one of my kind of oldest friends from high school, and since high school, she was very much into philosophy, and I was like, yo, I don't care about philosophy, and I don't know. And then throughout my life, as I grew, I was like, you know what? Like, just the way I look at the world is more like attuned to a philosopher than an engineer. Really thinking about the big picture, how things come together and work together rather than having like the engineering silo mode and mind. But I think that's part of who I am. As you mentioned, I have kind of 5 different engineering degrees. I am a double PhD dropout. I tried PhD twice, and then I realized it's not my thing. And now in retrospect, it makes sense, because going back to your point about being a philosopher and about my electrical, mechanical, bio, nano, and software engineering background, I really wanted to understand how the world works and comes together. So yeah, I love philosophy. As I mature, I appreciate it a lot more.
okay, so tell us a little bit more about that. So you just gave us a hint there, like, and just say that. All of the list I can't even remember because it's so long. So and your professional background is really so diverse, so interesting, so non-traditional, as well as the countries you've lived in. So first, tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get here, and like how did it all happen?
Okay, so I was born and raised in Iran. So I grew up in Iran, and I got my first degree in Iran. And then the week after graduation, I moved to Germany, and I was naive enough to decide to, to learn German in like 4 or 5 months, and then do my master's in mechanical and bioengineering in German language, which I do not recommend. It's a very hard language. It was really hard, but it helped me to really, really learn German. As a language. Is still not to write like an official letter. That is like another level. Even, college graduates in Germany are not necessarily good at it. It's a tough language.
Did
But
you have
anyhow,
any previous background in German?
I knew one sentence in German, which was Ich bin, and I thought it means I'm from, whereas it means I am. Like, you have to say Ich bin Sara, not Ich bin Iran. so technically, no.
Okay.
But I really was ready, and I really wanted to learn kind of, English at the time was my second language, but I learned read and write English probably even before I learned how to read and write in Persian because my mom's college degree was in English literature, and she was teaching English. But then when I did my master's, I saw this advertisement for a scholarship for a semester abroad. And when I went to and talked to my professor that, can I apply for this? He started laughing out loud. And I said, what's going on? He's like, you're an international student in our country and you want to get a scholarship from our country to go and, semester abroad. And I'm like, is this illegal? And he just looked at me. He's like, no. And I'm like, okay, I apply. And I think I was the first student in like more than 100 years history of that scholarship that I got the scholarship to come to US. And I came to San Diego, UCSD, to work on my master thesis, and I finished the research. I continued doing research in bioengineering department. The research was in Center for Magnetic Recording Research and like next generation of hard disk back then. And then I started, they opened the nano engineering department, and then after a year, there were some issues, and I'm like, okay, this is not working. And I transferred to UCLA. So that was the first PhD I dropped out at UCSD, and second PhD I dropped out was UCLA a year later. And I got another master's degree. So I just collected all these degrees, and later on I did a degree in software engineering. So yeah, this is,
so inspiring. Oh my God, so inspiring.
At one point, actually, it was maybe 10 years ago, I was thinking and reflecting, like your story doesn't come obvious to you. Sometimes, things, I thought, oh my God, I went to, engineering school in 3 different continents, 3 different languages, 3 different cultures, and even 3 different engineering cultures. And
Wow.
maybe that is what gives me just a very global, holistic view. I can't look at things in silo because I understand everything is relative. The way engineers are trained in Iran versus Germany versus US is very, very different. And kind of jokingly, kind of actually truthfully, you can also see the end result and how it impacts the culture and how culture impacts that kind of mindset of how to educate engineers.
That's fascinating. Actually, I'm really curious to learn more about the 3 engineering cultures and how are they different, and like in general. And also, I am curious to learn and hear a little more about your experience as a woman in STEM in all of those places. What are the culture commonalities? What are the differences between the different locations? Like, I'm really, really intrigued.
Yeah. Before continuing, I like to make this announcement that obviously these are my own personal life experiences and observation. Country of Iran and Germany, they have like more than 90 million population. And I went to one school, and then US 360 million population. And, but, like using the context of a stereotype for it, like maybe slightly constructive purpose. Because, a stereotype, I believe it could be used in 2 different ways. And then when comparing countries, maybe it just give us some context as just the tool. And of course, nothing is fact. And if it's just used to put people in bucket and not even giving a chance for them to show themselves to you who they are and getting to know them, it's a very negative context. So like, if I may call it a little bit more positive, a stereotype speaking. So your question was about how the experience was in different countries?
Yes. In terms of engineering culture,
Yeah.
and in terms of being a woman in all of those places.
Well, here is the claim, the controversial claim is that in Iran and kind of more also Middle Eastern region, with all the differences they have this one thing in common, that a majority of STEM graduates, more than 50-60%, are female. And in those countries, you become an engineer.
That's not a known fact, and that's incredible.
We can also dive into that conversation. I have some opinions on it, some hypothesis and theory. But in Iran, you become an engineer because you're good at math and science, and you want to be an engineer. End of story. That's it. In Germany, women are not inclined to become engineers. So the STEM graduates graduation rate is something between 20-30%. Okay. So in Iran, and also to some extent, the majority of the Muslim countries, even though there are enormous amount of cultural differences, but this fact exists that majority of the STEM graduates, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, yes, are female. More than 65, almost close to 70%. And as a matter of fact, in Iran, the government had to interfere, the opposite quota, to make sure the balance is 50-50 between male and female. In
What?
Germany, yes. I have a lot of theories and thoughts about it. I'm happy to get back to it and just share, why I believe that is. There's some research on it, and these are my personal opinion. But in Germany, my understanding is that in Germany and US, the STEM graduation rate for women is always under 30%, no matter how hard the countries try and the governments try to advocate for STEM for women. But I have differing theories in Germany and US. Germany has, and Nordic countries in Europe have, a lot of, their equality rate is much, much higher. There was an interesting research showing in the countries that women and men have more equality, women tend to gravitate more towards humanitarian and art and philosophy and classics than engineering or STEM. So that this applies more for Europe than US. We don't have as much equality if you want to compare to Northern Europe. And my belief is in those countries, women who go to engineering have like a kind of a different mindset. They're really nerds, focused on engineering, and fewer just, you need to have this upbringing mindset. And then kind of, it's really, really hard to want to decide to go to STEM fields. It's just, why do you want to do it? It's so hard, right? And I'm only comparing in the sense of in Iran, if you're good at math and science, you are going to become an engineer. There's no question asked, right? And in US, it's different. There are some super smart women. Again, my experience, I have seen that they go even do PhD of engineering, but their ultimate goal is to have a family and become mothers. And I have had some of my best friends who kind of either finished their PhDs and they were married and they wanted to have many children or some children, and then, or even in the last year, one of my best friends, the smartest one I've ever met, left her thesis unfinished after 6 years, and she wanted to have a big family, 5 children. So these are, again,
they stop everything.
Yeah. Well, she was like kind of helping her husband in the, so she wasn't really planning on going to workforce. And I think that's the difference. In Germany, if women go to engineering, they're really dedicated to their that field, and that's the kind of a difference I experienced. I'm not saying engineering women in US are not dedicated, but I'm just talking about the sentiment and the exposure I had. In US, it's just they're just smart, they can do it, but they have kind of nothing to prove. I don't know. It's like a really weird sentiment.
What do you mean?
I don't know. I mean, again, I'm going to a territory that is really hard, and I'm kind of exposing myself to a lot of criticism. But before anybody wants to do it again, I've got to say this is a gut feeling. This is based on no fact. But if I wanted to make a terrible stereotype announcement, and I admit it is terrible, I hope the audience will help me come up or help me work on this theory a little bit more and make sense of it, is that in Europe, in Northern Europe, the women who go to engineering, they have something to prove, because the expectation of society is like, why do you work so hard, And this comes from one of the experiences I had that is just accepted, that women are not attracted to STEM. And the experience was in one of my classes. It was a class of 300 students. And I sat next to one of my classmates who was German. And I turned around this huge auditorium and I'm like, where are women? I was the only woman in class of 300. And I look at my German friend, it's like, where are the women? And he's like looking at me and very, as a matter of fact, tells me like, women are not interested in engineering. And I am not kidding you. For like 2 long minutes, I was speechless. I was like, um, um, uh, literally, I didn't even know what question to ask. And I ultimately asked, like, what's wrong with German women? It could not, I could not register. And now going to the background of growing up in Iran, and I kind of claim that German women who go to STEM have something to prove. I think Iranian and Muslim countries, this is where it really that have something to prove also comes very strongly, because um, accepting or not, there is some sort of control over women in Muslim countries, and kind of oppression and limitation. And I think that is some kind of a drive to prove yourself, and then really drive, because this is the field that you have freedom. You can do whatever you want to. So you really are attuned to what you're interested in this field more than other countries, because they're not. Like, many times engineering degree for women is a future, working and, prestige and income and independence, and a better opportunities in life all around. So here is my kind of, or maybe if this is Iran, this is Germany, this is US, when I said American women don't have anything to prove, because ultimately American culture majority is, that American dream. You grow up, you get a degree, you have a family and focus, and it's still more patriarchal. In northern countries, it's slightly more matriarchy in middle management. In Germany, for example, absolute majority of middle management is female. And again, as they grow in ranks, again, the number of women drops significantly, but still compared to US, they have better statistic. And in Iran is the opposite. Like, women have a good start in career, but, making progress in the career is much harder in Iran and Muslim countries. But again, what I observed in Iran is the most, successful female entrepreneurs, they are lioness, they are goddess, they are so powerful and so um, kind of accepted and respected. And there's none of this BS around like female leaders have to be likable or not likable. They're absolutely perfect, comfortable in their femininity, and very powerful people. So, it's just these kind of stereotypes doesn't exist as much as in US. Like, how many times have we heard about this? Like, women cannot have it all. If you're strong, they call you bossy. If you're, if men are, they call them leader, blah, blah. So this is the dichotomy of, like, cultural infrastructure, that what kind of talent can grow on that land. We don't have these, the thing is, Iran culturally has kind of a balance of matriarchy and patriarchy. In government, it outside is, very strong patriarchy, but the core of nuclear of family, to some extent, we have this undertone of matriarchy, or even if not matriarchy, they're like the powers are completely divided, in a sense that even if the family is very patriarchal, and the woman is at home and the man is providing for the family, there are certain areas that men have no say in it. And interestingly enough, I don't know if you've heard of this, it is very common in Iran and Muslim countries that if the woman works and has an income, the husband doesn't touch it. That income won't be spent in household. This is women's money. So, this is like the culture intricacy that kind of like
Wow.
very weird, and then, it impacts the outcome. So it's like that patriarchal part is the job of a man is to provide. And many women, when they work, they very entitled to buy themselves jewelry, or do whatever they want to save the money, help their family. And then the man, doesn't allow, it's just the opposite, is non-manly for them to let their wife spend in the household. Versus in US, it's, the pressure and focus is on women to be, likable and very, prove their femininity in work. Otherwise, they're not likable, or they're bossy, or they're aggressive. So, I guess this greater undertone and like cultural shift is something that I see throughout my travels across the globe. I quite enjoy traveling for 3 years. And I was living in New York. I was based in New York, but I was technically traveling the world, coming back to New York for 2 weeks or 4 weeks. And I would just go different places and live and, explore. So I always had this interest in understanding the cultural undertones. And it's an analog process. It's not like the culture is not something that you hit a border, you move to the next country, and all of a sudden the culture changes. You see the similarities and differences as you're moving. And my simple, again, a stereotype understanding of this is when you start, let's say, okay, so you start from East Asia and you move towards West, Japan, for example, Korea. These are countries historically, even until a few decades ago, extraordinarily patriarchal. Japan, of all countries, has the highest level of education in female, STEM, and otherwise, the highest rate of female graduation, the lowest rate of female employment, and the highest rate of female suicide. And these are very directly rooted in the patriarchy in the society. That is, we have probably all heard of the stories of if a father is a businessman and they have a super qualified daughter and a very non-qualified son, the business goes to the son. And, the women might be always running the business in the background, but officially they won't be. There's a lot of stereotypes going on there. And women are obviously, Japanese women are super smart, super encouraged, because of, again, this pressure of patriarchy. The education is the way that they have the freedom, I feel. And that's what they, really outperform men. But then when you come to the societal level for job opportunities, you don't have the equal opportunity or the potential for promotion. You move toward China and the kind of matriarchal thing. We have all heard stories that women have very strong role in many of the Chinese. Again, stereotypically speaking, I'm not talking absolutes. It gradually changes when you come to Middle East. Like when you arrive to Iran, that's where the balance kind of exists. Outdoors is patriarchal, and household is very heavily matriarchal. As I explained a little bit. And then, as you move to Europe, when you go to Northern Europe, again, this balance shifts more towards matriarchy and equality. So outside the home and inside the home, and like both is reversed. You have a lot of men who are stay-home dads and a lot of, women who have careers making a lot more money than their husbands. When you go to South Europe, there's also another trend from north to south that, impacts the culture, and I'm going to talk about it. Then again, more patriarchal, maybe again, more matriarchy at home, but, when you come to business and work and outside home is more patriarchal. And then when you come to US, it's just an absolute individualistic culture.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, this change happened, heavily after Second World War. I was reading this article, it was mind-blowing that during the war, a lot of men were deployed to war. So women had to take a lot of jobs that traditionally were like truck driving,
Right.
factory worker, manufacturing, mine working. These were the jobs that, before Second World War, in early 20th century, it was unthinkable for women to take it. But they had to, push the economy forward.
Yeah,
But
I think
after
the famous "We Can Do
yes,
It" poster was meant for women to encourage them to take
yes.
men's jobs.
Absolutely. But the twist happens after the end of the war. All these young men come back to the country. They have the PTSD. They need to provide for their family. And now women have found this empowerment and like, yeah, I can work. I can have my own income. Even though until then, as a woman, you still couldn't have an independent bank account. You couldn't get a loan and none of that. But they were having an income. But a huge advertisement and marketing campaign is started to kind of encourage women to stay home. And that's when, if you go to the 50s advertisements and you see this like beautiful women staying at home, cooking and showcasing advanced refrigerator and oven and things like that, and heavily advertising that the best thing a woman can do is stay at home and be a good mom.
Bake
And
cookies.
yes, yeah. Bake cookies, bake dinner, like make dinner, and like if you look at the movies and TV shows of that era, they're all heavily focused that woman is staying at home and then like being a good meek wife and like be very feminine and like be very helpless and having the man help them and all they need to be is beautiful and run a household. And the TV show, what
Mad
is
Men.
that comedian? No, the the TV show that the woman is a comedian, a Miss something.
I
The
don't know that one.
that she's the set is in 50s, 60s, and she has a husband that is aspiring to become a comedian, and he's absolutely talentless, and she always does everything and bakes this like um, food and everything, takes to the comedy cellar to put his husband's name to perform, and she helps him with jokes, and eventually she has his awakenings and is like, screw it, the husband cheats, and she's like, she starts her own career as comedian. But that's kind of like showing actually how at the beginning of the show it like very perfectly explains what was the mentality, and nobody can believe the woman wants to work because she's from a really well-to-do family, but of all things comedy, right? So so and this is the undertone of the culture that impacted, but also the saddest thing, and I think this is what really shows the divide between Muslim countries and Europe and US, is this one article I read. The first speaking doll was released in the 50s and 60s, and it would speak 3 sentences. And guess what was one of the sentences? One of the 3 sentences this speaking doll would say. I think we talked about this if you remember.
I do.
Um,
But
and
let's
that
tell
was,
everyone else.
yeah, that was, I'm bad in math. Like, I can't imagine like that meeting, that this decision was made, this, memory has capacity for maybe 3 sentences. Let's, choose. And probably there are a lot of sentences that were, proposed. And who was the panel that chose for little girls at age 3, 4, that 30% of their exposure is I'm bad in math? So that comes into the play when you see, Western countries who maybe because of their financial uh, um, power and connection together, this kind of myth propagated, and Muslim countries because they didn't have this toy and they didn't have access to it, we're safe. Like, that moment that it happened to me at university and my German classmate told me women are not interested in engineering, I could not register it because it was, the field of study was never put in my brain as something that has anything to do with your genitalia. And I think, again, in retrospect, that blessing comes from the fact, like, again, controversial fact, that in Iran and majority of Muslim countries, K-12 education is segregated by gender. So girls go to a girls' school, boys go to a boys' school. So there is never exposure and competition. So none of this nonsense that you see of the coming of age TV shows and the actual culture that girls from age 10, 11, 12, like their focus is to be pretty and liked by boys and be cool. None of that exists because, the majority of exposure, the worst case scenario we had was like that moment of walking home, like if there was a boys' school in front of us, but they even had the end of school time different. So you wouldn't collide. So they kind of protected us for very nefarious reasons, but it had a positive impact, which was
Fascinating.
among your classmates, you were either good at math or you were not. You were either interested in science or you were not. Either you were interested in literature or not. And, we are 3 sisters. I'm the middle child. My older sister was always extraordinarily talented when it came to literature and languages. She speaks so many languages. Um, I was always math and science, and my younger sister was somebody, she was both
May I
talented
remind
in
you that you
math.
speak 3 languages, right?
Yeah, well, she speaks more, and then she like even her master's degree was
Your
like
standards
ancient.
are
I
pretty
know.
pretty high.
So her like master's was ancient languages. Like she speaks like she studied even dead languages. Forget about it, living
Wow.
languages. So, and my younger sister was the person who was talented in both math and art. She was an extraordinary artist from age 3. She would do paintings that you would think a 7-year-old has done, and she pursued art. My older sister pursued engineering, and then eventually, like literature and the culture, and then now she's an executive. And I did math and science. It never occurred to us it's weird. You were literally, you had that kind of opportunity without that judgment, without the society at age 3 telling you you're bad at math, or a competition and being in direct competition with boys. Among all my cousins, boys and girls, everybody knew Sarah is really good at math and science. End of story. There was no surprise. Oh, how could she be so good? She's a girl. It's like, she is, right? But in US
That's
and other countries that the genders are mixed, I think that pre-exposure to I'm bad in math. I was reading another study that was very interesting about the fact that majority of girls here think they are bad at math is not that they're bad at math or any worse than boys. It's because they are so good at literature and language that is so
mm-hmm.
effortless for them versus boys. So the amount of effort girls put in literature and languages is this much. For boys, is much harder. And the amount of effort that they both need to put in math is this much. But in comparison for girls is
Mm-hmm.
like, I learned something was so easy, and now to learn math, I have to put an effort, so it's hard. And for boys, it's like life is hard, whether it's literature or math. So they have a better chance to figure out if they're good at it or not. So there's so many different angles you can look at this, and see. I'm sure there's a lot more, references and, like little tidbits of like, who would have thought 3 sentences in a speaking doll would define the cultures for generations to come, that, governments and companies invest billions of dollars for attracting more women to STEM in these countries, and they can, and they fail. But anyhow, so
Let,
these are some of the
let's
thoughts I
market a
have.
new doll saying I'm an expert in math. I'm sure there will be a great
Well,
demand for
it's
that.
funny you mentioned that. I mean, there are like some movements, for
Right.
better or worse, happening. I remember when I was at Google, there was this internal mailing list among women, and we had a lot of passionate conversation. I even brought up all this. But one day, everybody was sharing this book for empowering girls, that book for doing this workshop and this thing. And one day I asked, what about boys? Like, yeah, we want to change the mindset of the girls, but
Mm-hmm.
what are we doing for boys?
Mm-hmm.
And because if we actually succeed to raise these wonderful, independent, strong, opinionated women, how are they going to find their mates if we don't do any change on our boys? Right? And then um, it just reminds me of, the sexual assault and rape culture that, I read this sentence once, is that you don't need to teach your daughters to be careful. All you need is to teach your boys
Mm-hmm.
to do not violate girls' space, or their body,
Yeah.
and then the problem is solved.
Yeah. We
So
don't
it's
need to
kind of
fix
like,
the girls there.
no. And that if every
Mm-hmm.
single mother and father was raising their son to respect women, that problem is solved. Like, it doesn't matter how careful you're going to be. I was a victim of sexual assault at very, like at my late teens, before, like early adolescence.
Sorry to hear
And,
that.
in the most unexpected, in my music class, right? Um, so the problem is, again, like it did, you couldn't think of a safer place to be in music class, and this happened. So anyhow, so going to, your point about like how to, to change and then, create a different doll. It's also, we need to look at it both sides. And right now, actually, we have this serious problem of in US overall, less women are graduated from STEM, but over the last few years, overall, way less men are graduated from college. Men in their 20s are making less money than women. They have this addiction to gaming that kind of gives them purpose and sense of accomplishment in their basements. They're uninterested in life. And then we're going to have a huge issue for having these people, Gen Zs, find their life partner that is equal, and could make them happy. If you have a lot of independent, strong women, educated women who can't find their, life partner. I want to also make a note. I'm like, obviously I'm a very gender and sexual identity inclusive, but I'm just talking about, this like gender identity of female and male, in
Mm-hmm.
contrast here, we're going to have a serious problem. And, an example of this was about a decade ago, it started emerging in China when they mandated the one child policy. A lot of families traditionally, because again, that like, valuing a boy because it could be the son who would help in the farm, for hundreds of years, that was the ideal in majority of majority agricultural cultures and communities. A lot of families would abort their child if it was a daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Because they wanted to have son for that one child. And what happened when these kids grew up, there were not enough women for them to marry. So,
It is
it's
still a
again like,
problem. It is still
yeah,
a
oh yeah,
problem today.
yeah. But this again, comes back to my thinking that you have to solve problems holistically. You can't focus on a silo. You can't only focus on empowering women and forget about, what is an ideal man in this society? Like, how do you describe it? How do you train them? Where is the book? Where are all these books
Let's
that
buy
are
more
creating?
dolls for boys.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah, and then and then we are mad at men who are not helping in chores, or with the taking care of the babies. If they were forbidden of touching or playing with dolls in childhood,
exactly.
what are we criticizing it for?
So I think by the way, totally get why your friend told you you should have been a philosopher. You are a philosopher. You really are. And I think like your perspective, your diverse perspective and your insights on like there were so many interesting facts that you just shared with us, and I really thank you for that. It was
Oh, of course.
like your global perspective is really special, and I wonder if like how were you using your insights from different locations and from different cultures when you got to a new place, like for instance, so you've mentioned the story about the guy who sat next to you and you were surprised by him saying yeah, women are just not interested in STEM. By the way,
Hmm.
this was I was under the impression, and like most data today, I'm really surprised by the fact that this is not the case for Muslim countries. This is really something that I wasn't aware of, but I know that like throughout the world, it's a very common fact and common knowledge that women are underrepresented, and it's a global problem, and we could find it everywhere. By the way, that stereotype of women just are just not interested in math or science or technology was really debunked, because like I actually have a talk about that when I tell the story about how up until the 1980s or mid 1980s computer science or
Yep.
programming was actually a feminine field. It was
Yep.
perceived as a feminine field. So how
Yep.
come it changed? If this is not
Well,
something like we're not wired differently, this is part of our upbringing. Yeah, okay.
to this point, gosh, I'm happy you brought this up. Something happened. I was yesterday at a UN summit of impact of AI in humanity. We were
Hmm.
talking, and there was like a very interesting panel. One of them is this extraordinary professor and lawyer working on AI ethics, and she was telling a story that she's probably in her, if I may guess, at least not her age, but her husband, because she mentioned something about her husband. I would imagine he's in his 80s or late 70s. And he said, we were talking about adoption. I was making a point that we all have to adopt to AI and then learn how to use it. Education moving forward is just lifelong. There's, you constantly have to upskill yourself. And she was saying it as an example that yes, her husband had to learn how to use a keyboard in his mid 50s because as a young man, he was told he doesn't ever need to touch a keyboard. That's all she said. But like, what is the underlying thing is that
Wow.
because as a man, You don't
Wow.
touch a keyboard because typing and keyboard work is a woman's job
Women's
because it's
work.
not
Wow.
sophisticated enough, right? So to your point, not only
Wow.
computing was a women's job, it was looked down upon. It wasn't, not valued as much. And we had brilliant computer programmers who kind of like made the innovation in tech and computer science possible. And the shift actually happened, to your point, around 80s. I have Apple to blame
Yes.
because Apple is the first company that started creating, like, the whole story of Apple is about Steve Jobs and his co-founder. They started. Until then, your only option to have a computer at home was you had to buy the pieces and assemble it. There was no real computer store that you could go and buy and assemble. When they started assembling for themselves, their friends wanted it. They started working with a computer part store and said, what if, they negotiated, what if we give you this and sell, and then, the rest is history. So they were the first company that really figured out how to create personal computing for, home use. And again, when they started advertising, for whatever reason, that again, what happened in that marketing meeting and decision and proposal, they started to advertise it as a thing for boys. For always the ads were boys using computer, and it was a boy thing, and American public bought it, and then Europeans, and then the rest of the world. And that's when the shift happened, and that's when the computer games came, and that's when programming turned into something that you do in a silo. You're isolated, you have in control of your time, and you don't need to interact. And obviously, women have this propensity to being more social and collaborative, and this really fit and kind of exaggerated and empowered that need, which is also, like, in retrospect, is not very, very helpful. And I just
I call it the rise of the computer geek. I once, in my talk about the history of women in computer science and about the rise of the male of the boy geek, computer geek stereotype. I did a research because, like, it's a common story. People heard, not everyone heard of it. Obviously, many people haven't, but there are a lot of there's a lot of articles about it online about how Apple did that, and how their marketing was, like, mainly targeting boys and men, and men at work, and fathers to buy for their sons, like
Yep.
the gaming computer back then. And I did a little research about it, and I searched for all of those images, and I will share with this episode the link to that screenshot of all of those photos, all of those advertisements of men, boys, and fathers, and just one or two for the girls. So, like, and it was like something that's, like, reinforced itself, because when they did come to school afterwards, and they arrived, and they were, like, the only women there, or the only girls in class, they thought, well, if you don't see others who look like you think, like, okay, so maybe I'm not supposed to be interested in that. And I also want to say something about how you said before that, in Iran, where you, like, there's the gender segregations in schools. Actually, also in Western cultures, when they have, like, different math classes, different coding classes, which are separated for boys and girls, or for it's usually they see it, like, in school, but you can see it in in colleges as well, when they have that experiment. The girls always have better grades when it's
Yes.
girls only, and for boys you don't see any difference, like it's the same for them, with or without the girls.
Yeah, why am I not surprised?
Yeah. So I could actually speak with you all day on that. Like I told you before, you are a philosopher, and every time we speak, like it's really 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 inspiring and interesting. So
Thank
before we
you.
wrap up, I want to ask you, like, today you are mainly focusing on generative AI, and you have you have your own series of events about the future of generative AI, and we all know that's where the future is headed. But I do want to hear a little bit more about your perspective, and what do you think its impact on the future, on our world
Oh
as
God.
we know it today, and what do you think, maybe we can try and focus it for the sake of women, or cultural differences in that sense. You can take it wherever you want, but um
Um, a good question. So if I understood the question is the impact of generative AI and on, women and, what is going to change. Is
mhm.
that correct?
Yeah.
As you said, I do host at least once or twice events a month, and the title is "The Future of the World Post Generative AI," and that's literally the question of, um, you know, looking forward in 3 to 5 years that a lot of applications of generative AI have creeped into our lives, how are life going to be impacted?
Hmm.
And I believe there is a sense of urgency to have these conversations and empower the public to learn and understand and have a voice in what direction the society takes. Because after all, generative AI is just a tool, nothing more, nothing less. But how we apply it, how we use it is very important. And I believe the last thing we want is another experience with social media that we just sat on the sidelines and we were just looking of the gods of Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and such. What happens, and that defined our lives. And the world was shaped, especially the first initial wave of social media, that I say, by a bunch of adolescents, no morale, no life philosophy, young male, right? And then they created this based on their worldview that was based on nothing, and then now for generations to come we have to pay back. There are statistics of suicide caused by social media or Instagram and such, eating disorders and self-harm and depression, and they're staggering. And then so this is now like a problem that governments and people have to deal with for generations to come, and there's no accountability and there's no responsibility. And when they call Zuckerberg to even the legislators question him, first of all they have no fucking idea what they're asking or talking about. They're like these guys in their 40s, 50s, 60s in politics, and they're easily spinned around as one big problem in this country, and maybe I don't know about other countries' government. But then even though they come there and they admit that there's like, yeah, there is like this numbers on suicide and all of this, did anything change? No. Did they increase the minimum age required for social media, although they have so many research supporting it's really harmful at that age? No. Did they kick out tens if not hundreds of thousands of kids who are even below age 13 and they know it and are social media? No. So I believe we have to really take a very proactive role in it. But then there are also a couple of other things that I'd like to add to consider. One is generative AI, using ChatGPT. Still, not every single person, educated person in this, in US or in Europe, I have seen people have never touched it, which is it's intimidating. I understand, and understanding how it
Still.
works and what is in. Oh yes, yes. There's no 100% adoption, right? So there are people who still avoid it, but then using it is one thing. It's like downloading another app, but understanding how it works is something that is
Hmm.
absolutely intimidating. With my 5 engineering degrees, I remember early last year, I actually was moving back from Europe to US. I wanted to move back to New York. I thought I'm going to come to San Francisco for a couple months and build my networking and refresh it and then move to New York. And then generative AI thing happened. And I'm like, oh, there's like a big wave in Silicon Valley. Let me stay. And at the beginning, it was intimidating for me to where do I start? How do I understand this thing? So I had to spend hours and hours going to events, reading, learning, and like nothing made sense until it did. So it took a lot of effort. But now there's no judgment. I understand why is it like if you don't have engineering degrees, even not every single developer understands AI or generative AI,
Most
right? It
developers
doesn't,
don't.
yeah, it really it's if you don't, it's not, it doesn't, reflect upon your qualification or IQ, your smarts or education. It's just a fact. So my goal in these events is to kind of bring this awareness and knowledge and help in a very non-technical way explain the complex technical matters, to create this knowledge and then hopefully empowering. And the analogy I use for that, the reason everybody with a super diverse background is needed to be part of this conversation and engage is, let's say Moran is an aerospace engineer and you're like the best aerospace engineer in the world. You're building the most advanced airplanes in the world. Like, the heck with it. You're the CEO of the most advanced startup in aerospace engineering. It doesn't mean you know anything about how to build an airport, how to run a control tower, how to price the tickets, economy versus, first class. You don't
How to
understand
make it
anything about
into a business.
exactly
Yeah.
impact of airline industry on local GDP or global GDP, the impact on global warming, or if the plane you're building is going to be used for humanitarian purposes or human trafficking, right? You are just building a tool and how it goes in the world and impacts it, you have no idea. And the same applies to even top scientists and researchers who are building generative AI. Ultimately, they're just building a tool and they have no idea what use case it's going to have. It's going to be for evil, it's going to be for good, it's going to be for both. But how to manage it, how to, prevent human trafficking, you can't. But the problem is the loudest voice in the future of generative AI right now is given to these researchers and CEOs of generative AI companies. Imagine in the airline industry, you want to research the global warming impact and expect those people to be expert. It just doesn't make sense, right? And that's why I feel anybody with whatever background you have, this is a tool that is going to impact your life one way or the other. If you're a parent, it is going to insanely impact. You have to be prepared. We don't know what is hitting us, but ignorance and putting your head in the sand is not going to help. And that's why I host these events and I usually do the Zoom. Always do the Zoom, not usually, for global audience. So if you like to participate, you can register. You can first connect to me on LinkedIn, and there is a short link on my top of the profile, which is number 3 founder, FOUNDER, unicorns with S, UNICORNS.com. It's like just a very simple Google sheet, register there.
We'll
And
share
I'm
it
more than
afterwards.
happy to share the events. And I like to take these events. I'm actually early October, I'm hosting one in San Diego, and I'm planning to do one in New York and also in Europe and globally, because this is something that we don't have enough of. We're a place that smart, educated people go. They learn about generative AI and they kind of participate. And the topics are very diverse. I had like event, for example, how the startups will change and shape. If we have generative AI agents right now, founders can automate operations. So we could have companies extraordinarily valuable. Today, unicorns, like, for example, is 200 to 300 million raised to reach that $1 billion valuation or $100 million in annual revenue. They raised 200 to 300 million. It takes 7 to 10 years, and it acquires hundreds or thousands of employees. So it's like a big, massive company. Whereas in the future, and it's already happening, a handful of founders could build something, if forget about 1 billion, 500 million valuation within a couple of years, and maybe with 20 to 50 million raised. So it's like a completely different game. And there's a lot of implication what happens to jobs. Some people, what I hate about it, like people go with a strong idea in these events and don't worry about your job. AI is going to only augment human capability, or, they're so pessimistic. And like the answer to all these things is it's not black and white. We're going to land somewhere in the gray area. But our awareness, the questions we ask, the effort we put in as humanity is going to decide where on the scale, and then if it's the constructive or destructive area of the gray we land on. And ultimately to my events, like last thing about them is, my intention is not to answer questions. I always tell my audience, if you come to my event with 5 questions, I have succeeded. If you leave with 50 questions, because I strongly believe as long as we start asking the right questions, if I can help people to ask the right question, to dare to understand, to engage, they're smart people. They can figure out the answers, and my mission is accomplished. So yeah, I hope to see some of you there.
I think that's the perfect ending, because I personally feel like after listening to you that I have 50 other questions running in my head, and I'm sure, and I really hope that our audience will feel the same. And because you've touched on so many important topics, and I really want to thank you for joining us today, Sara, and for telling us all of that wonderful and fascinating stories about your background, and about the and about the cultural differences, and that math hating doll. So thank you so much for today, and thank you everyone for joining us at the Backstage Stories of Women on Stage. We hope to see you again, and visit us on womenonstage.net, and follow us on social media. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if there's anything I can help you with. I'm more than happy. And thank you, Moran, for having me. It was such a pleasure, and I had a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks to everyone who joined in. We'd love to hear your feedback and your thoughts. Join us again at the Backstage Stories of Women on Stage. Visit womenonstage.net and follow us on social media.